listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to discuss philanthropy, or something else. What is philanthropy, and why is it that these people in positions of power in this world disguise their motivations behind tax-free foundations, philanthropic organizations, things that espouse to be for the greater good of mankind, and about the redistribution of their own wealth for the purposes of doing good? At least that's what they tell you. That's what their purposes are. There's an awful lot of these philanthropic foundations out there that have done an awful lot to steer social agendas and to steer national and international policy in many ways in our society. That is a fact, Jack, pretty much. Foundations have played a huge role in this. So, with that being the case, many of these charities are a false front for something else, and we're going to explore that avenue of thought here tonight. They certainly care a lot about us, don't they? At least that's what they claim. They care about the little guy. They just want people to get ahead, don't they? So, that being the case, they set up these philanthropic organizations and use them as a front to do other things. Tonight, we're going to explore some of those possibilities and some of the history behind some of these groups and the things that they have done. The things they have done in the name of philanthropy. And tonight we're going to be reading from a book by the late, great Eustace Mullins titled The World Order. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he wrote this book sometime in the 1980s. The publication date escapes me at the moment. But that's not important. What is important is the information presented herein. So that's what we're going to cover. So we're going to be reading tonight from a portion of this book titled The Foundations. Let's get right into it, shall we? Because there's a lot of ground to cover tonight. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these philanthropic organizations. They are all over the place. They have very famous names attached to them. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, various other ones. I'm surprised we don't have a Rothschild Foundation here in America. At least not the public face called Rothschild Foundation. But we'll see. They all have their dirty fingers in everything in this world. These billionaires and rollers and shakers that so want to help everybody that they wind up hoarding the wealth for themselves. Doing things with it that they have no business doing. And of course, they think they know better than you and I about this stuff, and that's why they act how they do. But let's get right into the reading here. The world order controls the citizens of the United States through the tax-exempt foundations. These foundations create and implement government policy through their staff members in key positions in the executive, legislative, and judiciary departments. The foundations create educational policy through their staff members in key positions at every level of the educational system. The foundations control religious doctrine through their staff members in key positions in the leading religious denominations. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So Mr. Mullins here pointing out the fact that they've infiltrated into government, into education, and into religious organizations. So just from those three standpoints alone, that's a very large sector of society. Very large sector of society. Giving them a foothold in positions of authority and ostensible leadership positions in so doing. Let's read on. Foundation is a misleading term. Webster calls it an endowment, but a foundation is really a trust, which Roget states is a syndicate. If instead of Rockefeller Foundation we were to say Rockefeller Syndicate, we would be much closer to the truth. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Spot on. Rockefeller Syndicate. It sounds like an organized crime family, doesn't it? That's exactly what it is, but when they call it the Rockefeller Foundation, it gives it an air of legitimacy. That's what they've done. They've disguised their true intention and motivations behind these facades of being a good thing, being a philanthropic organization, when in fact what they are doing is committing high crimes through these groups, bypassing elected governments, bypassing representation of the people, and steering whole agendas by controlling the purse strings. That's what's been done here. Let's continue reading, though. Alpheus T. Mason, in his biography of Justice Brandeis, quotes Brandeis as pointing out that, quote, socialism has been developed largely by the power of individual trusts, end quote. What we have, then, are criminal syndicates masquerading as philanthropic enterprises, while they inflict socialist world slavery on nations and peoples for the benefit of the world order. Norman Dodd, Director of Research for the Reese Committee, in its attempt to investigate tax-exempt foundations, was asked by Congressman B. Carroll Reese in January 1954, quote, do you accept the premise that the United States is the victim of a conspiracy? End quote. Yes, Dodd told them. Then said Congressman Reese, you must conduct the investigation on that basis. B.E. Hutchinson, chairman of Chrysler Corporation, although approving the goals of the investigation, warned Dodd that if you proceed as you have outlined, you will be killed. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So here, the guy from Chrysler Corporation, one of the big wigs at Chrysler, the chairman of Chrysler Corporation, warned Dodd, hey, don't go through with this or they're going to kill you. That, my friends, is very serious. That's high treason. That's murder. That's conspiracy. That's the very definition of conspiracy. If you have powerful people working together to ensure that they keep their wealth and power, and they do things even down to threatening Congress people with death threats, this is some serious high treason going on. Keep that in mind. Let's continue, though. Dodd stated, the foundation world is a coordinated, well-directed system, the purpose of which is to ensure that the wealth of our country shall be used to divorce it from the ideas which brought it into being. The foundations are the biggest single influence in collectivism. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Remember that term, collectivism. It's an important term to these New World Order types. They love the notion of collectivism. That's just code for communism, in case you didn't pick up on that yet. Collectivism is just a code word for communism. Much like socialism, same thing. There are some distinct differences between socialism and communism, but socialism always leads directly to communism. That's just the simple historical facts of things that's been proven time and again. You see, what usually happens is any type of a nation who adopts a democratic form of government or governance, whether it be a representative republic like what we have here in the United States, or some other form that calls itself democracy, what eventually happens is it tends to lean towards more what they call democratic ideas, and they shift the focus and definition to democracy. And they begin calling it a democracy when it is not that at all. We live in a republic. That is different. It's a representative republic. It is not a democracy. And our politicians very much today use the term democracy. And they're all about defending democracy. Democracy, what happens through democracy is when you allow a representative republic or a system like what we have here to devolve into what they call democracy, what always arises from that is socialism. And then from socialism always arises communism. And always, invariably from communism throughout all the history we can look at, communism always devolves further into fascism. And you wind up with gulags, democide, the murder of a country's own citizens. 262 million people under Stalin. 262 million people under Stalin and Mao and the various others. I can't just blame Stalin for that. But the numbers are staggering. That's in the 20th century alone. Democide, the largest single killer of people in the 20th century, being murdered by their own governments. That's what we're talking about here. And all these things get instituted by outside organizations that have their own political interests at heart, directed by many of these alleged philanthropic organizations. You know, these organizations that seek to do what's best for the people because they think they're so much smarter than everybody else because they just happen to inherit a couple $1 billion. Think about that. They think they're smarter and better because they have money. And therefore they could apply money towards those things they want to see come to fruition. And they think that's doing you a favor somehow, that they have your best interests in mind. I don't think so. Doesn't sound legit to me, folks, but that's what they do. Let's read on here and see what else Mr. Mullins has to say about this, because so much of what this guy wrote is significant today. So if you haven't picked up any of his works, by all means do so. Pick up something he's written and read it. Even though he seems a little bit extremist in his viewpoints for the time, he was spot on with many things. But let's continue. The 1975 report of the Rockefeller Foundation showed a $100,000 grant to the Institute for World Order, operated by Professor Saul Mendlowitz, who states in the Institute publication Transition in October 1974, quote, "I am arguing for a new governance or alternative institutions to those now responsible for global concert. People will be demanding a central guidance system. It means a governance is about to come into being in which the policy elites in various nations or nation-states who have the authority and capacity to make decisions will no longer have that as their prerogative. There will be a governance that will say, you can't build an army anymore. You must give a certain amount of your economic income to other areas of the world," end quote. Gonna pause for a moment there. Doesn't that sound very much like what we do here in the United States of America? They take the sweat of our brow, the work we put in, our labor, our toil, the earnings we get from that. They tax us at a rate of about anywhere between 40 and 60% of our income. And they ship a lot of it overseas to places that may or may not really need the extra help. Oftentimes, there's some kind of a sweet political deal going on, or there's some kind of criminal activity going on behind the scenes that they try to keep hidden. Ukraine. But that is beside the point. But the whole notion here is they like to send our hard-earned dollars away to other places, and this was all planned, and in fact, this is being pointed out right here in this 1975 article. This is what they had in mind all along. They don't want people to, or nations to have standing armies anymore. That's all going away, too. In fact, the whole notion of a standing army or a military at this point, this is all just for show. It's all for show. The real weapons are information system weapons. Mind weapons. It's a war for your mind. We talk about this kind of thing all the time. They don't need standing militaries anymore. They got you glued to a computer screen. You'll believe anything that comes across it. Or a TV screen. It's all about psychological manipulation. It's all psyops now, folks. That's the nature of the beast these days. All psyop. And there's not much we could really do to change that at the moment. They're warring to control our minds. They want to control our perceptions. And these notions of standing armies, having battles, this is all just a war for the mind once again to instill fear in the public, gain control of the perception, keep the public opinion right where they want it with these various things. And I think right now they understand that it's not a popular notion here in America that we keep sending money to Ukraine. But of course the American people, well, they're largely only fed one side of the conflict, for the most part. They see Russia as being the big bad enemy, the boogeyman enemy. Putin is the big bad boogeyman. You see, they always have to have one of these. Saddam Hussein used to fill that role very well. Then Osama bin Laden filled that role. Right now they've got Putin. He's the big bad boogeyman. But once they're done doing what they're doing here, he'll fade into the background again, just like before. But the whole point is they have to have this fear instilled in the public's mind and the threat of a standing army invading sovereign nations and destroying buildings and killing people and all this unnecessary stuff going on. They have to keep that perception in the minds of the masses so that you think it's so terrible what's happening to these poor Ukrainian people, and we need to support them however we can. So, yes, go ahead and send them my tax dollars. That's essentially what has been done here. They've molded much of the public consciousness into accepting this. And even if you don't accept it, well, there's not much you could do about that. Not much at all, because they keep these unelected officials who make these international policies. Well, they go ahead and give the go-ahead to send this funding there and earmark this funding for that. Your money's already in the coffers there. It's already in the government coffers. So they just go ahead and do with it what they want. It's crazy. But the whole point here is this. It's simply just to keep your mind in this state of fear, fearing that perhaps some foreign enemy somewhere who hates you for no apparent reason will come here and kill you if we don't do something about that, if we don't keep the national borders safe and use all of these security measures and the military machine that we have to defend the sovereign rights of people. What a load of bull. They don't care about your sovereign rights. They never did. They never will. The governments of the world do not care about sovereign rights. All they care about is the state. And that's the bottom line with all of this. But at any rate, that's enough of my rambling. Let's get back to the reading here. In short, a world order, no national armies, no private incomes, no individual freedom. Ironically, all this is being financed by those who created wealth by the exercise of individual freedom in the United States. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So this is kind of ironic, isn't it, that you have some of the very people that got very wealthy doing what many Americans would like to do, doing what they love and actually building something and providing a service or goods that somebody needs and making a hefty profit in doing so, and being so good at it that they manage to make a windfall out of it. So some of these original families, I would say, yes, there was some of that going on here in America. In some of the early days of America, you had new opportunities for people, and some people were able to take advantage and make a whole lot of money. But those people aren't around anymore. Now it's their offspring that have very much taken over these businesses and these different things that their generations prior to them built. And this is a dangerous situation when you have somebody who grows up knowing nothing but wealth and privilege, and being taught in all the best schools and given all these different advantages over everybody else. They don't have a clue what the average person goes through, and they see other people who struggle, and they think very little of them, and they think, well, we need to help these people, and of course we're able to do so because we're so much smarter and better. So let's go ahead and we'll meet together with all the other eggheads who think they're smarter and better, and we'll decide what these people can and cannot do because it's for their own good. So this creates a very dangerous situation because you have somebody who, first of all, they didn't build that. I mean, to quote Obama, you didn't build that. So you wonder where some of these tropes come from, right? Well, do you remember that? I don't know if some of you folks out there remember that far back when Obama was up there saying, "You didn't build that," and tried to claim that government made it possible for businesses to succeed and such, when the opposite is true, when businesses and people who had a type of motivation to make things, supply services and goods for others, and were able to make these things happen, they actually are the ones who brought about the wealth in this nation and were able to spread that wealth around so that governments can go ahead and arrange programs for building roads and stuff like that. They're not very good at it, even still today. I live in Pennsylvania. We have the worst roads in the country. The worst roads in the country. And you know what? It's all headed up by PennDOT, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, a government agency. And it's terrible. We have the worst roads that there are, despite sinking millions and millions and millions of dollars into it every year. In fact, the Pennsylvania Turnpike is the most expensive toll road in the entire world, and they just raised the rates again. And it's still terrible. The roads aren't worthy of the cars. They insist that you have to get your car inspected to make sure it's roadworthy, but the roads are not car-worthy. And these are the same people that will tell you, you didn't build that. You didn't make a successful business. You can't do anything without Big Brother, the government, to help you along. And by the way, give us 60% of your income. So, do you see the dichotomy in thought here? But at any rate, so we wind up with these billionaires and millionaires who are second, third generation inheritors of something their grandfathers built. And they don't have a clue. You hear so much of this with a lot of businesses, and some of them actually will run the business into the ground. But what has happened is many of these people who were smart with their money, they formed some of these foundations and they hid away their money in tax-free foundations. And using the guise of doing philanthropic work, they could use these things as a tax write-off and not have to pay any taxes, and they could keep this wealth hidden away in the auspices of these different tax-free foundations. And they can accomplish an awful lot of their own personal agendas and goals. That's what's happened here. So many of these second and third generation wealthy folks who were the inheritors of successful businesses, well, they funded their own little pet projects through these tax-free foundations. And that still goes on today. Certainly does. This is not a new thing to anybody listening here. I'm sure everybody who's listening to this is aware in one regard or another the harm that's been done through the auspices of tax-free foundations and philanthropic organizations. Just think of the World Economic Forum. This is one such example of something like this. Where do they get their money from? Like, how does this work? People support these things thinking they're doing some good, oftentimes as well, because they claim to do good things, but how much of that money actually goes towards doing something good? That's what you have to ask, but I went ahead and I started rambling again, so let's get back to the reading. I want to try and stay on track. Sometimes my side tangents go a little long. Sorry about that, but let's continue. Mendelovitz does not use the word government, which might imply a government by the consent of the people, as in the United States. He uses the term governance, the imperial form, meaning a dictatorial decree. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Understand that. I've pointed this out in times past on many different programs. There's a difference between what we call government and governance. And now I think Eustace Mullins described what governance is very emphatically here. He says governance is the imperial form, meaning a dictatorial decree. That's what governance is. So a presidential executive order, not truly a law, not truly a portion of government or an act of government. This is governance. It's a totally different thing. And the question you have to ask is how much legitimacy backs it. And that's the whole point here, because not a lot of legitimacy backs many of these things that they call governance. Because it's all put in place and instituted by unelected officials without your consent. Oftentimes it's the meeting of the minds between these philanthropy groups, trying to figure out how they want to proceed forward, what's going to best benefit them, and what's going to best benefit the people in their point of view. What's best for everyone? That's what they claim to take into consideration, but they don't really know. How would you know what's best for everyone? Think about that. I mean, I know what's best perhaps for myself and my family, and maybe some people that I interact with on a regular basis. I might have an idea as to what's best for them, but not at any time do I take it upon myself to assume that I know what's best for those others. Now, my family, that's something different. That I know and I have a direct hand in. That's the point here. But these people, they don't personally know some of these people that they claim to know what's best for. They don't have a clue. And yet they try to take that air on themselves. And many people are happy to just absolve themselves of the responsibility and give it away to others to take care of them. That's a sad notion in and of itself, but that's what these philanthropic organizations have taken advantage of in a big way. Let's continue with the reading here, though. Every act of the Foundation syndicates and of their masters in the world order is intended to implement a ruthless type of Oriental despotism. As is traditional in this type of despotism, the most efficient palace servants are eunuchs. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Now, you can see some of the inherent biases and stuff coming out with Eustace Mullins right here, with some of the ways that he talked and spoke about things. But I'm going to say he's not really wrong. Historically, he's not wrong about this. Now, how do we apply that to the modern age? That's the question here. But let's continue reading, and let's see what he says about this next. So Eustace Mullins goes on here to say, eunuchs work for little or no pay because they do not have the expense of rearing families. In the Foundation world, we find the eunuch as the predominant type of official. The eunuchs move in and out of the foundations into prominent posts in government, education, and religion. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So he's referring to the term eunuch, and he's referring back to some of the ancient cultures where the palaces, the kings, and the rulers put eunuchs in charge of various departments because, well, they understood this, that the eunuch isn't going to have a family to worry about, not raising children. Why do you think they openly promote this LGBTQ nonsense and try to instantiate these people into positions of authority all throughout corporation and government and everything else? And the tax-free foundations are rife with these people, these social justice types that don't have a clue about what your average family man has in mind for himself and his family, or your average mother of children wants in for her children, what your average family, your traditional family, would want. They don't even care about that. They don't want to think about that. They look down their nose upon that notion, and this is all part and parcel of this overarching agenda of control. So regardless of what your stance is on the whole LGBTQ, whatever, however many letters they add to it now, thing here, regardless of your stance, what you have to understand is it's been heavily politicized and it's been weaponized. It's been weaponized as a tool for the control of the masses, and it's been something that's been desired by those people in charge in this world because it leads to depopulation. The ultimate ends of following that whole path in life is depopulation, and they know this, and this is exactly what they want. And they want these types of people to head up certain projects because, well, they know they don't have a future and they don't care about other people's future. They don't have progeny that they want to try to build something for or pass off an inheritance for. That's the whole point here. Now, I know this sounds like a broad generalization, and it kind of is, and I don't want to paint anybody that identifies in that way in a bad light. Don't get me wrong. But I'm just pointing out this is how they've weaponized the idea, because it's generally, historically, a very, very tiny percentage of the population that falls into that category. But it has been pushed and promoted heavily in the mainstream, in the entertainment, in the culture, in the news media, all over the place. They're trying to normalize it and make it seem like everybody should fall under that banner. And everything is acceptable except for being straight. That's exactly what they're pushing here. And it's just something that irks me, but I don't want to get into that much of a side trail about that whole notion. But Eustace Mullins is pointing this out. This is the reason why people in positions of governance want these types of people who have these attitudes in positions of power. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. And this is hearkening back to ancient history, because this is a known commodity. This is recorded history. This is what many rulers and kings have done in the past. They've put these people in charge of many things for these various reasons. And you would be foolish to think that there's people in positions of power today that don't want the same thing, because they certainly do. It looks a little different today than what it did then, but keep in mind, same old playbook. So let's continue reading here. So Eustace Mullins goes on to say, in the foundation world, we find the eunuch as the predominant type of official. The eunuchs move in and out of the foundations into prominent posts in government, education, and religion. Although they may marry and have children, psychologically they remain eunuchs, those who have forsworn their manhood to become palace servants of the world order. Columnist Jeffrey Hart recently commented on this type, referring to Mondale's selection of Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential nominee. Mondale should have chosen a man in order to balance the ticket, end quote. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this is showing the time that this book was written. This was in the mid to late 1980s, as I recall, because that's when Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro were running. I remember that presidential election. Excuse me. But at any rate, so this is when Eustace Mullins was writing about this. Let's read on and see what else he says. He says, we well may ask, if the world order is in control, why do we need an institute for world order? Why do we need the foundations as guarantees of the order's control? The answer is that the world order rules because it conceals its power. It denies that it exists, although its power is obvious everywhere, in the government, in education, in the religious orders, in the wars and revolutions and famines which are so meticulously planned and executed. The world order, like the mafia, refuses to acknowledge its own existence. Its subsidiaries come and go, but the order remains constant. When too many people discover the Council on Foreign Relations, power is moved into the Bilderbergers or the Trilateral Commission. The order's control remains constant. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. He's not wrong about this. They shift their focus from one of these groups to another. This is how they operate. This is how it's always been done. The various secret societies, and I would call these perhaps like the Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. These are your political secret societies. They're semi-secret. They're not really secret. We know about them. We know who comes and goes in these. Bilderberg, until about 10 years ago, was completely secret. They never even acknowledged it existed, even though they've been meeting in secret since 1954. Long time that's remained hidden away, not acknowledged. Now it's acknowledged, but I would say these are your political secret society groups. Now there's occult secret society groups that commingle with these as well, and I think that's where they shift around this power of where the meeting place is or who's involved. This is what Eustace Mullins was referring to as the world order. This is the centralized group controlling all of this. The ones we might refer to as the Illuminati, let's put it that way. But let's continue reading here. The New York Times noted April 29, 1984, that 1,400 officials were attending the annual meeting of the Council on Foundations. There were 21,697 foundations in the U.S., which in 1983 distributed $3.4 billion in grants. These grants are dispensed only to those who implement the program of the world order and whose goal is world slavery. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Almost 22,000 foundations existed in the United States in 1983. Imagine how many more there are now. And in that time, they distributed $3.4 billion in grants to people for various things. That's a lot of cash in 1983 dollars. It's a lot of cash today, but that's certainly an awful lot of cash in 1983 dollars. So think about all the things they could get done with this money that they dispense around for their various pet projects. Think about that. Let's read on. It says, these grants are dispensed only to those who implement the program of the world order and whose goal is world slavery. The international banking families, whose origins go back to the Middle Ages, set up the principal American foundations to protect the wealth they had amassed in their dealings in slaves, drugs, and gold, and to perpetuate that wealth through means which can only be described as imperial decrees, government charters, in order to neutralize all potential rivals or opposition by controlling them and directing or misdirecting their opposition. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So these are some big charges being levied here by Mr. Mullins. But I will ask the question, is he wrong? He's really not wrong. He's not wrong about this at all. And that's the sad part. And most people don't pay attention. Don't pay attention. They don't even think twice. That many have probably heard of the Rockefeller Foundation and don't think too much about it. They think, oh, it's great. They give away money and they, help people go to school and help back medical innovations and things like that. Yeah, that's the cover story, folks. But they don't bother to delve into researching what exactly they do. That's the problem. They just see them as being this organization that gives away all this free money to these deserving people. Not necessarily the case. It's all about the agenda. If it fits the agenda, they do it. They'll give away money towards something that suits their agenda. But if it doesn't suit their agenda, well, they're being tight-fisted with those dollars. And oftentimes they do it for all the wrong reasons. It's all just to save face or create a public persona, holding up their integrity, and to avoid the nasty taxes they would have to pay on their billions if they didn't do something with them, reinvest them in some way. But let's continue reading here. None of the charters of the foundations indicate their real purpose. They are replete with such phrases as the well-being of mankind, the elimination of poverty, the elimination of disease, the promotion of world brotherhood, compassion, caring, charity. These are the watchwords of the foundations. There is no hint to the unwary of the despotic instincts which drive these caring people to promote world wars and world slavery, nor is there any warning to the menials of the foundation that if they falter at any time in their dedication to the goals of the world order, the penalty is sudden death. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks, just to point out, once again, he's not wrong. This is exactly what they have as their mission statements. It's all the same old nonsense about the betterment of mankind and compassion, the elimination of poverty, well-being, promotion of brotherhood, yada, yada, yada. That's not what they're really about. Not at all. That's all in their mission statements, and they always put on this good front. But they never really tell you what it is that they're doing. They use these platitudes, these very vague platitudes like universal brotherhood and elimination of all disease and poverty and helping mankind. Well, what does that mean? What does all that mean? These are very vague terms, and this is exactly what they do. They keep the mission statement general so that they have all kinds of leeway to do what they want, and they'll claim some such thing or another as to the reasoning behind their investment or their giving of endowments in this way, or grants to certain projects or people. That's what they do. But there's always an underlying motive that they don't tell you on the surface. So Mr. Mullins is not wrong about that. But let's continue with the reading here. Many eunuchs who became a liability to the world order have been eliminated without mercy. When Hiss, White, and others faced congressional investigations, many of their acquaintances became casualties. A lawyer named Marvin Smith, a close friend of Hiss, fell out of a window. Lawrence Duggan, an intimate of both Hiss and White, who was slated to testify when he fell out of a 12th-story window. Duggan was an official of the Institute of International Education, of which his father was founder and president, but these family ties offered him no protection. In his haste to get to the window, he tore off one shoe and left his office in a shambles as he fought his way across it. The verdict was suicide. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. That's two people who ostensibly accidentally fell out of a window when they were about to testify about something. We hear so much of these stories. I can't attest to the truth or falsehood of these types of stories. I don't know enough about this. I don't remember enough about these situations. I'm not even 100% certain who he's talking about here with Hiss and White. Who these people are. Apparently they had some kind of ties to one of these philanthropic organizations and didn't like what was going on and were about to talk. And they were under investigation. And of course they committed suicide. At least that's the official narrative. Because, a lot of people will lose one shoe and trash their office before they jump out the window. That sounds perfectly normal, like as if they were putting up a struggle. Maybe they were fighting against themselves. Who knows, but that's the kind of thing that officialdom would like you to believe about this stuff. Let's continue reading here. The Canadian diplomat Herbert Norman and the Harvard professor F.O. Matheson also went out the window before they could be made to testify about their associations. The phenomena became so common that it gave rise to a new term, defenestration, meaning the avoidance of testimony and a suitable warning to others who might think of talking. We have read ad nauseum about men of great wealth who, after careers of astounding ruthlessness, while amassing their fortunes, suddenly underwent a profound conversion, like Paul, and became men of goodwill. It is true that the benefactions of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers are the most potent influences in American life today. They collect ever higher taxes, increase the control of government over every aspect of human life, and plan more wars and revolutions to further their goals. From the outset, American foundations have exhibited a twofold image. In front is the tireless do-gooder who balks at nothing if it serves a good cause. Behind him are the evil conspirators who are intent on preserving and increasing their wealth and power. The foundation in its present form originated in the concept of a Boston family, the Peabodys. Henry James, in his novel The Bostonians, ridiculed a family friend, Elizabeth Peabody, for her 50 years of relentless humanitarian zeal, portraying her as the legendary Miss Birdseye. George Peabody, after slave trading operations in Washington and Baltimore, moved to London, where he was set up as a front by the Rothschild family. He amassed a fortune by buying up depressed stock in American panics and chose a Boston trader, Junius Morgan, to carry on his business. In 1865, Peabody set up the first large-scale American foundation, the Peabody Educational Fund, endowing it with $1 million in government bonds. By 1867, this had grown to $2 million. By 1869, $3.6 million. Ostensibly set up to educate Southern Negroes after the Civil War, it was a key operation in the carpetbagger strategy to gain control of Southern lands and to control their state governments. These states had to borrow heavily from Wall Street bankers to rebuild their services, and they remained deeply in debt for the next century. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So think about this. This Peabody Education Fund gave an endowment of $1 million in government bonds. So it gave away $1 million, and yet somehow it grew to $2 million the next year and $3.6 million the following year. Where does this money come from? If you're giving it away, how do you get the money back? How does this money grow if you're giving it away? Think about that. This is what these foundations do all the time. A lot of it has to do with tax dollars, government tax dollars, funding them. Because of the philanthropy they're doing, it's a gimmick, it's a guise, it's a racket, to quote Smedley Butler. Not only is war a racket, but these types of practices performed by these tax-free foundations is a racket. They fund various things, and they collect money on the backside of it through government grants. And then they somehow amass more wealth by doing this. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Let's read on, though. Because of its international connections, the Peabody Fund attracted a stellar board of directors. General Ulysses Grant served on its board for 18 years. Grover Cleveland served 14 years. McKinley, 2 years. Theodore Roosevelt, 13 years. J.P. Morgan served on the board for 28 years and never missed a meeting. His partner, Anthony Drexel, served 12 years. A fund with similar goals was the John F. Slater Fund for the Education of Freedmen, established by John F. Slater, a wealthy northern textile manufacturer. Set up with $1 million, by 1882 it had grown to $4 million. The 3 original trustees were President Rutherford B. Hayes, Daniel Coit Gilman, and Morris K. Jessup, treasurer. And I'm going to pause for a moment right here, folks. So I'm assuming you probably recognized that many of these names that were listed here wound up becoming American presidents. Do you think that's a coincidence? That they were on the board of directors of these tax-free foundations and somehow they just so happened to wind up becoming president of the United States? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Makes you wonder. Let's continue reading, though, because we still didn't even get into the really juicy stuff yet. Let's go here. When John D. Rockefeller discovered that the foundations offered the road to world power, the Peabody Fund proved to be his model. He and his director of charity, Frederick T. Gates, gonna pause for a second here, folks. No relation to Bill Gates. They will always tell you this. Frederick T. Gates, no relation to Bill Gates. It's just coincidence they have the same last name. They're not related in any way, shape, or form. No sirree, not at all. Nope, nope, nope. And that's what they will shout from the rooftops when you question it. But this Frederick T. Gates, not related to Bill Gates. Now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and continue reading. Frederick T. Gates set up the Southern Educational Board, which merged with the Peabody and Slater funds. They later set up the General Education Board, which absorbed its 3 predecessors. Its charter stated that its purpose was, quote, the promotion of education within the USA without distinctions of race, creed, or sex, end quote. Its goals were racial amalgamation and the abolition of distinctions between the sexes. Its incorporators included its first president, William H. Baldwin, Jr., the president of Long Island Railroad, formerly with Union Pacific. The Harriman Schiff operation, going to pause for a moment here, folks. The Harriman Schiff operation, these were the representatives of the Rothschild family here in the United States, the Harrimans and Schiffs. They were bankers, they were central bankers that were sent here by the Rothschilds to set up shop, and they successfully did so keep that in mind. It says Frederick T. Gates, Rockefeller's right-hand man, Daniel Coit Gilman, Vice President, Peabody Fund, and the Slater Fund, President of the University of California from 1872 to 75, the President of Johns Hopkins University, 1875 to 1901, and first President of the Carnegie Institute. Gilman was an original incorporator of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Institute. The fact that one man was an incorporator of three of the three most influential foundations in America shows how centralized the control of these supposedly autonomous foundations has always been a few ruthless individuals. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Same thing today. A very, very small group of people control all of this. This is how they institute top-down control in this world. When you keep in mind the board of directors of all of these various tax-free foundations and philanthropic organizations and various other political think tank groups and stuff like that, it's all the same people in charge of all of them. They have their grubby fingers in all of it. This is how you centralize power and disguise it, because we have all these ostensible different foundations out there that are supposedly doing good works. And it's the same people running all of it. This is how it's done. This is the operational standard put forward originally by the secret society groups. This is how they do it. They put their guys in positions of prominence and power within these select places, and they give this image or this impression, this perception of diversity, when there's no actual diversity. It's all the same people running the show, promoting their agendas through all these various facades. That's what goes on with these tax-free foundations, these philanthropic organizations. And here's proof positive right here. This Gilman guy was one of the main founders of the three most influential of these groups in the 1800s, the late 1800s, when they came about. One guy had a lot of say in all of these different foundations and how much of our society has been influenced by these foundations. In fact, I mean, look at our medical system. That's entirely the Rockefeller medical system that we've been given. It's where they directed and put the monies. That's where the medical system went. And we adopted very largely an allopathic medical system where we stepped away from homeopathy and naturopathy and all of these other different types of medicine. And now you only have primarily allopathic medicine going on as the standard in our society, because that's where the Rockefeller money went. It went to training up the new doctors in the allopathic medicines, not promoting the other types of medicine. And there's always been natural medicine, homeopathy, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, all of these different forms of medicine that have been practiced, and many have had fantastic results through the years. They all got pushed to the back burner because the Rockefellers only wanted to push and promote allopathic medicine. So keep that in mind here. That's just one example of how much influence these organizations have had. Let's read on here. So it says, Gilman is usually listed as a charter member of the World Order because he, together with Andrew Dixon White and Timothy Dwight, set up the Russell Trust at Yale in 1856 to finance the Skull and Bones organization, whose members are leading frontmen in America. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So there's another tie that binds right there. And this is a direct tie back to the occult secret societies and fraternal brotherhoods. The Skull and Bones at Yale. This is chapter 322 of the Illuminati. Chapter 322 of the Illuminati, the Skull and Bones. And this is only one of these organizations with occult ties. back to the secret societies, the mystical fraternities, the occult brotherhoods. Some of these are pseudo-Masonic organizations of sorts. It's all the same teachings as we've talked about before with all of this, but the Russell Trust at Yale was set up in this way to finance the Skull and Bones. This is another foundation, the Russell Trust. Another tax-free foundation that provides money directly to initiate various students that have a lot of promise into the secret brotherhoods so that they will perform the will of these occult fraternities. Very interesting, isn't it? Let's read on here. W. Averill Harriman, Vice President George Bush, and propagandist William Buckley of the National Review are typical members. Norman Dodd, also a Yale man, said, quote, "It was well known on campus that if you were tapped for bones, you would never have to worry about success in later life," end quote. Yeah, you think so? If you were Skull and Bones, you're set. John Kerry is also a member of the Skull and Bones. He and George Bush, both members, even though they ran in a presidential election against each other as the most bitter of enemies, they're fellow bonesmen. More facade for you. Fellow bonesmen. You see how this works? It's this ostensible perception of diversity, but they're working towards the same thing. They're all working together. And their goals are not what's best for you and I. They don't care about us. They could not care less about the everyman, although they claim to. It's the same old, the same old New World Order, like I always say. Let's read on here. Of the three founders of this order, Dwight became president of Yale. White, son of a railroad millionaire, was said by the New York Times to have inherited enough money to make him free from care for life. He became the first president of Cornell University and gave the institution $300,000 to set up its school of government. He became the first president of the American Historical Association and was U.S. ambassador to Russia from 1892 to 1894 and ambassador to Germany in 1897 to 1902. His final legacy was to advise Herbert Hoover to set up the Hoover Institution. However, it is with the third founder, Daniel Coit Gilman, with whom we are most concerned. Gilman trained John Dewey in collectivist theories of education at Johns Hopkins University. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. John Dewey still has a profound influence on our education system today. This guy got things done, and this Gilman is the one who indoctrinated him, and I would say probably initiated him into the secret schools. That's just a guess. Just a guess, an educated guess, but that's neither here nor there because that's against the scope of what we're talking about today. That's outside of the scope of what we're talking about, so I'll let that rest. That's an assumption on my part, and I reserve the right to be totally wrong, but I would not be surprised about this. Let's continue reading. Dewey went on to head the University of Chicago School of Education and later Teachers College of Columbia University, two of the leading Fabian socialist schools in the world. Gilman, through his protege Dewey, has dominated American education throughout the 20th century. Gilman also trained Richard Ely at the Johns Hopkins Department of Economics. Ely later taught Woodrow Wilson, whom he describes as, quote, unusual, brilliant, end quote. Thus, Gilman's influence extended through Ely to Woodrow Wilson, who gave us the Federal Reserve System, the income tax, and the First World War. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. If you've never read the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, do so. Tells about the way in which the Federal Reserve was secretly set up and instantiated almost overnight, put into place against the better judgment of the vast majority of the American people. And Woodrow Wilson was instrumental in getting this done. Woodrow Wilson, a tool for the world order. Let's read on here. Although American, the three founders of this order were educated at the University of Berlin, where they were indoctrinated in the Hegelian philosophy of determinism. This philosophy of education and government teaches that everyone can be controlled and must be controlled in order to achieve predetermined goals. It is the philosophy of Oriental despotism transferred to Europe and adapted to the greater individuality of the European peoples, from whom most Americans are descended. As founder, Frederick T. Gates, once again, not related to Bill Gates in any way, shape, or form. They'll make sure to assure you of that time and again. Could they be lying? Oh, yeah. But they assure you, no relation. As founder, Frederick T. Gates wrote in the General Education Board Occasional Paper No. 1, quote, "In our dreams we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk." End quote. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. All right, I'm gonna gag at that last sentence here. What a friggin' joke. And notice he's talking about rural folk, and, Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States. But I assure you, he's no relation to Frederick T. Gates. But let's go ahead and continue on. That's all coincidence, folks. Nothing but coincidence. The members of the world order regard everyone as a peasant. They have only contempt for those who are too naive to see that they are being robbed, tricked, and enslaved. Other original directors of General Education Board included Morris K. Jessup, a banker who had been treasurer of the Peabody and Slater funds. He was a director of Western Union, a Kuhn Loeb-controlled company, Metropolitan Trust, and Atlantic Mutual Insurance. Robert C. Ogden of John Wanamaker Company, who served as president of the Southern Educational Board, Tuskegee Institute, Union Theological Seminary, and Hampton Institute. Walter Hines Page, who was as ambassador to Britain, helped involve us in World War I. Sir Roderick Jones, chief of Reuters News Agency, at its historic address, 24 Old Jewry, London, relates a bit of history in his autobiography called A Life in Reuters. A luncheon given by him for General Smuts, Sir Starr Jameson, and Dr. Walter Hines Page, all three of whom had Rothschild connections. And here's his quote. This is from Sir Roderick Jones, chief of the Reuters News Agency. He says, quote, "We dined in a private room at the Wyndham Club, the one in which 20 years later the terms of the abdication of King Edward VII were settled. We drifted on to the questions of the U.S. entering the war for which Britain and France so patiently waited. Dr. Page then revealed to us under seal of secrecy that he had received from the President that afternoon a personal communication upon the strength of which he could affirm that, at last, the die was cast. Consequently, it was not without emotion that he found himself able to assure us that the U.S. would be at war with the Central Powers inside a week from that date. The ambassador's assurance was correct to the day. We dined on Friday, March 30th. On April 2nd, President Wilson asked Congress to declare a state of war with Germany. On April 6th, the U.S. was at war." End quote. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this goes to show just how much influence these fraternal organizations and these philanthropic foundations have. They have a huge amount of influence. They knew prior to this being done that this is what they were going to do. Probably directed it to happen. Let's be honest about that. Let's continue reading here. Can anyone fail to make a connection between the director of a charity designed to control the education of every citizen of the U.S. and its director who conspired to involve us in a world war? Another incorporator of General Education Board was George Foster Peabody, a member of the family which had set up the Peabody Fund. He married Katrina Trask, relict of Spencer Trask, a wealthy stockbroker who specialized in railroad issues. Their estate, Yaddo, a magnificent upstate mansion, was left as a foundation to provide writers and artists a place to work. The grantees, one need not add, have been unanimously and relentlessly liberal in their philosophy and work, although they have regrettably failed to produce any significant contributions to American art or literature. Of course not. Spencer Trask had been killed when someone shunted a freight train onto the line carrying his sumptuous private car. George Foster Peabody promptly moved into Yaddo with Katrina and lived 10 years with her before marrying her in 1921. She died shortly thereafter, and Peabody adopted a lissom young divorcee, Marjorie White, when he was informed the church would not allow him to marry her. He then appointed her sister, Elizabeth Ames, the director of Yaddo, where she remained as virtual dictator for many years. The music room at Yaddo displays a large bronze plaque, which reads, quote, George Foster Peabody, lover of men, end quote. Peabody was appointed the first director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914, serving during the crucial years of World War I until 1921. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and later became a director of FDR's Warm Springs Foundation and the Hampton Institute. Louise Ware writes in her biography of Peabody, quote, he added that the national crisis, World War I, it says in parentheses, when every man was needed, should ensure the Negro opportunity, end quote. Peabody was chairman of Combustion Engineering Corporation, president of Broadway Realtors, director of Mexican Lead Company, Mexican Coal and Coke, Mexican National Railways, Tezitlan Copper Refining and Smelting, and served as treasurer of the Democratic National Party. Despite his capitalist background, Peabody was always an avowed socialist. Ware notes that he wrote to Norman Thomas, quote, I have always been most sympathetic to individual socialist aspirations. I have particularly observed the Fabian system of England with hopeful anticipations, end quote. The admirer of Fabian socialism is the man who helped install the General Education Board as the guiding force behind all educational developments in the U.S. since 1910. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Ever wonder why our school systems are so undergirded with all these socialist notions and communist type notions all the time? All these liberal attitudes. Well, they were founded that way. These are the very people, the ideas that these people had who made these tax-free foundations, these philanthropic organizations. They're the ones that set up the General Education Board. This was bound to happen. Of course they're going to indoctrinate people with their own ideologies. That's what it's about. It was never about trying to help people better themselves. Of course not. It's about promoting an agenda and keeping the reins of power and wealth firmly in the hands of those that have it already. That's the whole point here. It's the creating of this neo-feudal system where we have the ruling class and the ruled class. The ruling class wants to keep a firm grasp on their rule and keep those of us that they see as lesser under control because they know what's best for us. Let's read on here. The Springfield Republican noted in October of 1866, quote, for all who know anything of the subject know very well that Peabody and his partners in London gave us no faith and no help in our struggle for national existence. They participated to the full in the common English distrust of our cause and our success, and talked and acted for the South rather than for our nation. No individual contributed so much to flooding our money markets with the evidences of our debt in Europe and breaking down their prices and weakening financial confidence in our nationality than George Peabody and Company, and none made more money by the operation. All the money that Mr. Peabody is giving away so lavishly among our institutions of learning was gained by the speculations of his house in our misfortunes." End quote. This editorial was also reprinted in the New York Times, October 31st, 1866. The writer did not know that Peabody was a front for the Rothschilds, or that the establishment of the Peabody Fund was intended to give them political and financial control of the impoverished South, or that it would inaugurate the era of the foundations as the controlling factor in American life. John D. Rockefeller used the General Education Board funds through Standard Oil representatives in Russia to provoke the Russian Revolution in 1905. No wonder the Soviet masses cheer when a Rockefeller arrives to visit them. To date, the Rockefellers have given more than $5 billion from stock income, meaning that Americans have had to ante up billions of dollars in taxes, which would otherwise have been revenue on this income. Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, proved in 1967 hearings that 14 Rockefeller foundations held assets of more than $1 billion in Standard Oil stock. Not only did they pay no tax on this stock, but it gave them permanent control over the family-owned firm. Rival financiers could not buy control of Standard Oil because its stock was insulated by foundation ownership. As Patman pointed out, the fact that the Rockefellers escaped paying huge sums in taxes gave them an unsurpassed market advantage over other firms, which had to pay normal rates of taxation. The agitation for increased corporate taxation adds to Rockefeller's advantage. Patman said, "The foundations are the best investments the Rockefeller family could have made." Going to pause for a moment here, folks. Absolutely. They bypass so many things by doing this in this way. That's why it's beneficial for them. That's why they could continue to accumulate massive amounts of wealth in this way. It's a ruse. It's a ruse. The whole thing's a ruse, this whole philanthropic organization bit. There's nothing philanthropic really about it. They're doing what they want and claiming that it's helping people. That's what's been done. Let's read on and we'll wrap it up here very soon. A family member, Senator Nelson Aldrich, shepherded the General Education Board charter through Congress. The Rockefeller Foundation charter proved more difficult. It was a flagrant effort to evade government decrees against the Standard Oil monopoly, but was finally pushed through in 1913 by Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York, setting aside $50 million in Standard Oil of New Jersey stock for charitable work. The Rockefeller Foundation charter was signed on May 22, 1913. Its incorporators were John D. Rockefeller Jr., Henry Pratt Judson of the Lyman and Pratt families, president of the University of Chicago, Simon Flexner, educated at the University of Berlin and the University of Strasbourg, had served with Rockefeller Institute since 1903 as professor of medicine, Starr Jameson, personal counsel to John D. Rockefeller in his benevolences, Jerome D. Green, secretary of Harvard Corporation, 1910 to 1911, banker with Lee Higginson of London, 1912 to 1918, secretary of Reparations Commission at the Paris Peace Conference, Wycliffe Rose, professor, Peabody College, secretary, Peabody Educational Fund, trustee of Slater Fund and General Education Board, and Charles W. Eliot, also of the Lyman family, married Ellen Peabody, educated in Germany, president emeritus of Harvard. In offshoot, the China Medical Board secured Standard Oil the market for oil for the lamps of China, and gave the family on entry into the highly profitable Asiatic drug trade. The breakthrough was obtained after they financed the rise to power of the Sung family, who created modern China. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So are you beginning to see just how much power and influence this notion of these philanthropic organizations have. And it's all in the hands of a very few people. We see these same couple of names here, don't we? Over and over again. They have influence everywhere. Let's read on and we'll wrap it up. The list of officers of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1913 to 1963 reveals a great deal about this organization. The 4 chairmen of the board have been John D. Rockefeller Jr., Walter D. Stewart, John Foster Dulles, and John D. Rockefeller III. Walter D. Stewart served with Bernard Baruch of the War Industries Board in 1918, was with the Federal Reserve Board from 1922 to 25, and then joined the law firm of Case Pommery, a Rockefeller firm. He was economic advisor to the Bank of England from 1928 to 1930, special advisor to the Bank for International Settlements 1931, Presidential Council of Economic Advisors for Eisenhower from 53 to 56, and later president of the Institute for Advanced Study. In this list of legal and financial posts, one is struck by the conspicuous absence of any charitable endeavors. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Yeah, these guys ran charities, and they also ran all this other stuff. Think about that. The Bank of International Settlements. Is that not a conflict of interest? I would think it is, but they won't see it that way, will they? Let's read on. John Foster Dulles, a senior partner of the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, carried on the firm's traditional investment in promoting wars and revolutions. Few Americans know that Sullivan and Cromwell's intrigues made the Panama Canal possible. A 736-page volume, The Story of Panama, the U.S. House hearings on Panama in 1913, offers hundreds of pages of documentation proving that William Nelson Cromwell, founder of the firm and Dulles' mentor, instigated and promoted the Panamanian Revolution for J.P. Morgan and J.W. Seligman. Morgan subsequently received $40 million in gold from the U.S. Treasury, the largest check it had ever drawn to that time. $35 million of this sum was clear profit. President Theodore Roosevelt sued the New York World for libel for printing some of the facts about himself and Cromwell. The case was unanimously thrown out of court by the Supreme Court. We find in the Roosevelt-Panama libel case against the New York World the following, quote, on October 3, 1908, the Democratic National Committee was considering the advisability of making public a statement that William Nelson Cromwell, in connection with M. Bunua Varilla, a French speculator, had formed a syndicate at the time when it was quite evident that the U.S. would take over the rights of French bondholders in the De Lepus Canal, and that this syndicate included, among others, Charles P. Taft, brother of William Howard Taft, and Douglas Robinson, brother-in-law of President Theodore Roosevelt. These financiers invested their money because of a full knowledge of the intention of the U.S. government to acquire the French property at a price of about $40 million, and thus, because of the alleged information from government sources, were enabled to reach a rich profit, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment there. This would be called insider trading today, and is totally, totally illegal, unless, of course, you are a politician like a Nancy Pelosi or some such thing. Then it's perfectly legit. But if you're Martha Stewart, they'll stick you in prison for a while just to make an example of you. But that's neither here nor there. So this has been going on a long time, all of this stuff. And we have many, many more examples here listed by Mr. Mullins. As to the beginning stages of all of these different foundations, even things like the Guggenheim Foundation, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, there's all these different foundations, the Heritage Foundation, Edmund E. Day, Wharton School of Finance, Guggenheim, all of these different foundations and their connections to universities, their connections to government agency, their connections to foreign investments and interests. So we have this. This is a clearly demonstrable thing. If you go back and you delve deeply and look at these different organizations, these foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, I think it is more fair to call them a syndicate, as Eustace Mullins pointed out in the beginning here. Seems to me the whole thing has been used as a type of device for control outside of the realm of the normal channels that we consider. It's a type of governance structure, and remember the difference between government and governance. These tax-free foundations, these philanthropic organizations, are used as a type of governance board by those who really run things in this world. National and international governments are a joke. They're controlled and steered by the policies made within these foundations. So keep that in mind. This is part of what you might call the invisible government behind the scenes of things. Now, this portion of this book by Mr. Mullins keeps going on and on here for many more pages talking about these foundations. And eventually it comes to a program here. We'll just read this little portion to give you an idea, because this is where eventually, when you go through the history of it, where it winds up. So we're going to start from here, and I'm going to read a little bit more before we sign off. So listen to this carefully. In 1978, corporations gave Brookings $95,000. In 1984, this figure had jumped to $1.6 million. Most of their $13 million budget continues to be paid by the major foundations, the Ford, the Rockefeller, the Carnegie, the Milbank Memorial Fund. All those foundations, the foundations work together not only because of their close interlocking, but because they have a common program. Now keep this in mind. This is going to Brookings Institute. They first began giving Brookings Institute money in 1978 to the tune of $95,000, and by 1984, it was $1.6 million, okay, given to them from these different foundations to institute certain programs. Now, if you don't know what Brookings is a think tank group that advises policy, national policy for the United States government on many, many different projects. So, that's what's being said here. So, Mullins says the foundations work together not only because of their close interlocking, but because they have a common program. And he tells you here what the common program is in the next portion. That program was published by Karl Marx in 1848 as the Communist Manifesto. And here are the tenets of this Communist Manifesto and of the program that these foundations have in mind. Number 1, the abolition of all property in land. Number 2, application of all rents of land to public purposes. Number 3, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 4, abolition of all right of inheritance. Number 5, confiscation of property of immigrants and rebels. Number 6, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of waste lands and improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8, equal obligation of all to work. Number 9, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 10, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Number 11, gradual abolition of distinction between town and country by more equitable distribution of population over the country. Next, we have free education for all children in public schools, followed by combination of education with industrial production, and finally here, abolition of child labor in its present form. The foundations never oppose or contradict a single plank of the Communist Manifesto. The program has given us vocational training instead of education, which is a different form of child labor. And he lists off the present directors of Brookings here that were pushing these ideologies very heavily. But we'll skip that portion because I assure you today it's still very much the same. Even though many of the names may have changed, we still have these same things going on. And these same planks of the Communist Manifesto are still in place here. They've been instituted and instantiated very carefully here in the U.S. So, what do we have to say about all this? Seems to me we're given an illusion of choice that this entity that we call quote-unquote government isn't really what's calling the shots at all. It's all political theater, folks. I tell you that all the time. It's all theater. Behind the scenes, you have people running through these foundations and these philanthropic organizations instituting policy and putting policy in place and using their think tank groups like Brookings to make recommendations to governments, and governments go ahead and institute what they want. And it's more about governance than government. So even if the governments don't get it done, they will use governance structures in corporation and various other ways to get things done. Think back to what's happened here the past 3 years. How we see an example of this in the whole approach to this COVID scamdemic that they pulled off. Well, they went ahead and they recommended everybody wear a mask. But who was enforcing that policy? It was the private businesses. This is how you distinguish governance from government. Because officially, government could not tell you, you have to, this is mandatory for you to do so. They make it sound as such, and they threaten the businesses that perhaps they can possibly get a fine or get sued or some such thing if they don't follow and comply. But ultimately, it's up to the business, the individual business or corporation, to enforce their policies. These are not government policies. This is the business's policy. You must wear a mask in this store. Do you remember seeing all of that? This is an example of the difference between governance and government, and it is absolutely 100% an example of how they get things done outside of the auspices of government when they have to. But most of the time, government just follows through with whatever their policy recommendations are that they are given from these various philanthropic organizations. You see, folks, it's disguised as helping people when in reality, it's about controlling people. That's what it is at the end of the day. And I think Eustace Mullins did a very good job exposing the history of a lot of this. And we see this going on today. So is it really philanthropy, or is there something else going on? Well, I would say use your discernment, and I think it won't be a far stretch for you to realize there's something else going on. And it has nothing to do with benefiting humanity at large or helping your fellow man. It's all about control with these people. Same old New World Order. Anyway, folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in. That's all I have for tonight. I want to remind you all I appreciate each and every one of you, and we'll catch you next time. Have a good night now.
Come with me.